Welcome back to Markets Today. I'm your host, Mbithe Mwema. It's a day after Safaricom announced its half-year results. These numbers were down 6 percentage points, with the company reporting earnings and profit after tax of 33 billion shillings. We take some time today to unpack these numbers. Joining us virtually is Mrs. Tracy Kivunyu-Mose, who is a senior telecoms analyst at Telema. Tracy, a very warm welcome to you. Let's start off by you giving us an overview of these financials and what your thoughts were. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Mbithe. The results were disappointing from where we stood. Of course, it was a very difficult season looking at how COVID has rampaged businesses across. But telcos in their nature have been largely insulated from being very, it's more of an essential service. So you expect that as much as revenue downside is there, not to be as much, but the impact on disposable incomes was clearly seen in the numbers, where as much as we saw growth in where you expect in areas such as mobile data and fiber to the home, the growth wasn't strong enough to offset the very strong declines we saw in MPESA going as low as minus 15%, and voice as well, which was down 7%. So the results reflected a very difficult economic profile, marked by, of course, the lower disposable incomes from the customers coming in to affect those revenues and even the profits as a whole. So it was a very disappointing performance from where we stood.
Okay, so I hear you saying that MPESA was actually a big surprise there. I know the growth perspective was minus 14.5. I think the market was expecting some weakness, but not a decline in terms of growth. Perhaps we can start there as we unpack the service numbers. Tracy, just give us what happened with the service numbers, what was the drop from what point to what point, then you can break it down for us, especially focusing on MPESA, then we can talk about voice later on. Over to you, Tracy.
All right, service revenues came down 5%. As I said, the biggest drivers there were MPESA, which was down 15%, voice down 7%, mobile data a bit strong at 14%, and fixed data rather flat, although fiber to the home specifically grew very strongly at 47%. So to look at MPESA revenues, for example, we of course expected a slowdown because of the fact that the government had reduced, or rather made transactions under 1,000 shillings free. But the extent to which the volume of transactions grew in that level, in that kind of cadre under 1,000 shillings was unprecedented. And so this meant that as much as there was increased volume, the fact that these transactions were free really affected the revenues for MPESA, which is why you saw that decline of 15%. The other thing that we should also talk about there is that despite being a cashless economy during the COVID period, MPESA did not necessarily benefit in terms of this revenue performance because the cost also went up. The fact that customers were depositing more on MPESA meant that agents who are still incentivized for that meant that the commissions still went up instead of going down as we've seen before. So that meant that the revenues went down and the cost for MPESA went up as well. So that was quite negative for MPESA during this period, but we're hoping that in Q4, which will be January to March 2021, when the charges come back, that we'll see a return to growth. In terms of mobile data growth, which was 14%, that would have been healthy growth in normal circumstances, but considering the heavy spike in traffic we saw during the COVID period, it was quite disappointing. And the reason for that is that Safaricom had to subsidize the cost of data to ensure that the traffic remains high. So we do not see the benefit of elasticity of demand because of that huge cut in pricing did not correspond with a monumental, like a very huge increase in the usage per customer. And for that reason, we only saw a growth of 14% while we're expecting growth of north of 20%. If we look at voice revenues voice revenues have been declining over the last 3 years or so, and this is because of the dynamics of customer usage. There are other cheaper forms of communication, such as WhatsApp or Skype or Telegram, which customers favor. And this is a natural dynamic for a mature telco business, such as Safaricom. So it wasn't really a surprise that voice revenues came down. And of course, even with competition struggling to get traffic to their end, it means then that voice revenues are going to continue to be impacted even in the future, in 3 to 5 years, so to speak.
Okay, thank you so much for that elaborate view. I think our graphics team will help us and put out the rainfall chart that just shows the evolution of revenue from the previous point. Our graphics team will be putting that up just to show us what was the revenue point for the last period and how did that evolve and reduce by 4.7% in overall. I have a follow-up question, Tracy. When you talk about MPESA, it's very interesting that you bring out the element that Safaricom still had to maintain this as a service by paying out commissions to the agents just as a way of incentivizing them. What is the future then of MPESA? Because I hear you say that possibly Q4 could change, but then that change will only happen if the Central Bank of Kenya decides to make a change in terms of allowing Safaricom to charge. It's an extrinsic factor. Can you look at Safaricom today based on that extrinsic factor, or is there possibly a bigger downside when it comes to looking at Safaricom and the essence of M-Pesa on its platform? Back to you, Tracy.
Okay. The thing is that the M-Pesa ecosystem still depends a lot on the cash that's coming in converted to virtual money. And so the velocity, or rather how many times a transaction goes through the M-Pesa platform, is very important for the profitability of M-Pesa. So this is going to be a priority for Safaricom in the long term. And they're actually happy to see more money come into the M-Pesa platform, because in the long term, it will mean that customers will be using M-Pesa more and more. But the issue which you've brought up here, and it's very relevant, is that
okay, so bit of a technological slowdown there, but we are back. Tracy, can you hear me? All right, so we were discussing M-Pesa, and the key thing about M-Pesa is its value in the Kenyan business. Today, it is contributing in terms of material value when it comes to how much money comes in and out of M-Pesa as an ecosystem. It's actually a multiple over and above the Kenyan GDP numbers. That's what Tracy was explaining. Tracy, just before we lost you, we were discussing the effect of M-Pesa, and you're trying to tell us what is the downside when it comes to regulation and what is the upside in terms of the possible new business that Safaricom has gotten. If you can hear me, please take that question, Tracy.
Yes, I'm sorry about the technical difficulty. Yes, so when you're talking about velocity, which is how many times an M-Pesa transaction can go through, I would say this is very important for Safaricom because it increases the usage per customer on M-Pesa, which makes the service more profitable. For example, businesses, we've seen a huge spike in the number of tills and the number of Lipa and M-Pesa merchants that are now signed up for M-Pesa services. And the new service launched maybe 2 or 3 months ago for small businesses, or rather micro SMEs, to have a business sort of M-Pesa line for them to transact their businesses. Is also one of the other measures we're seeing Safaricom implementing to widen the scope of how M-Pesa is used in Kenya today, not just for person-to-person transfers, which also increases its profitability. But now this becomes a factor of affordability. We've obviously seen a very strong increase in volumes of transactions coming through the M-Pesa platform since the government mandated Safaricom to reduce the charges for transactions under 1,000. So it begs the question that affordability might be a very big issue for customers wanting to use M-Pesa. And while the government said that from January rather, Safaricom can continue charging on M-Pesa, we can't really take it as a guarantee, because looking at the volume of transactions, regulation may now push to increase the volumes of virtual transactions, meaning that there is more pressure on Safaricom as it stands to reduce its transaction charges. The assumptions that we've been given for guidance for FY21 are assuming that transactions will become chargeable again in January 2021.
Okay.
But without that guarantee, then it means we should be worried about M-PESA revenues not really returning to growth and continuing maybe not as strong as a decline of 15%, but definitely some slowdown in revenue to continue for the next year. But as I said, this would be predicated on whether regulations will lift for Safaricom so that they are able to continue charging once January kicks in.
Okay, fair enough. I know we're talking about Safaricom, but it's just very hard to complete the whole conversation on M-PESA. I have one more question on M-PESA and voice, and then we can move over to the expenditure side and then the future outlook in terms of earnings growth. Now, yesterday, the company did have a media briefing, and they did allude to the fact that they did spend a bit more in terms of capital expenditure in the period that just ended, especially in terms of investments in M-PESA. Management said that there was an upgrade from R4 to R6, meaning that they want to use M-PESA as an innovation platform, and rather than using it and relegating it to a transfer of payments, sort of evolving it into a financial services platform. What does this mean? Do we expect to see a change in the model of Safaricom? Is there the wherewithal for Safaricom to use M-PESA within this country, outside of the market? In other words, do we have a Safaricom that looks very different from the Safaricom that we have today? And is there a market opportunity for that? Back to you, Tracy.
Yeah. So the financial services sector in Kenya has been quite fragmented. And we could say that M-PESA has a unique opportunity in that it's able to contribute across various segments of the financial services system. So you have the payments side, you have the lending side, you have the insurance side, and you have even the fintech side, where we're looking at using financial technology for things like pay as you go for gas or solar power, or things like that. So M-PESA has been able to be a platform, whether by itself or through partners, to ensure that it's playing a role in each of those services. So where Safaricom is coming in now is to take a more primary role in the financial services platform provision, so to speak. We already have, subject to regulatory approval, partnerships with Visa, partnerships with international money transfer and even e-commerce platforms. We have partnerships with even asset managers to roll out asset management services. We've already seen them going quite strongly in the lending platforms, with Fuliza performing quite well. So, and also as well, we have Ethiopia, moving into Ethiopia to probably launch mobile financial services when approvals are gotten in the long term. So we are definitely looking at a different Safaricom. The core of it is the same, which is to ease and financial access for its customers. But the dynamics into how deep M-PESA goes into payments and other financial services has definitely improved. There's also talk of going into insurance services in the future. So I'm quite excited to factor these opportunities into my numbers, because it means then that M-PESA is now growing beyond just the telco ecosystem. It's becoming more of a standalone service, and we should actually see that coming to fruition maybe in 5 to 7 years from now.
Okay, fantastic. Wow, that's already an overview of the entire business model. Let's just quickly hear your comment when it comes to voice. So you are saying that there was a drop in voice comparing this year to last year. This drop has been happening for the last 3 years. Is the drop in voice expected to continue? And secondly, is it a consequence of people calling less, or is it a consequence of Safaricom losing market share in the voice market? Over to you, Tracy.
I would say first, yes, we expect this trend to continue into the long term. This is not just something that is unique to Safaricom. Other telcos globally are witnessing massive drops in voice, either flatlining or declining year on year. So I don't expect it to go down by 7% as it did this half, but definitely something around 3 to 4% year on year is not something surprising for me.
Okay.
The dynamics of why voice revenue is declining, I would say it's a mix of both, but most of it will be because of the customers changing their behavior on how they use the telecom services. As I said before, there's a lot of alternative methods of communication that are way cheaper, over-the-top applications such as WhatsApp, where you have instant messaging. You don't necessarily have to pick up that phone to make that call. Second, there is the fact that the second and the third players in the market are quite aggressive on pricing, meaning that you, as much as the customer behavior is also changing outside of using traditional voice as it is, you're also seeing the competition coming in with lower rates per minute, meaning that the double whammy of both sides means that there's no really it's very hard to grow voice revenue in such a market. Okay. But I will conclude and say that the primary reason for voice revenues declining will be the changing customer behavior more than Safaricom losing market share in voice.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview of the service revenue, and we focused on data as well as MPESA and the contribution from voice. Our graphics team will just help us out. We will put out those charts out for you so that you can just see the evolution over the last 6 months. That's a chart on contribution to MPESA as well as a chart just showing you what has happened to voice as well as mobile and fixed data. Tracy, let's switch it up and now let's look at the expenses. What was happening with expenses? What was the outlook on margins? Was this expected? Are they being more efficient or less efficient?
Okay, there have been, actually, save for some one-off movements, I would say that the efficiency that Safaricom has been deriving year on year still was seen this year. In terms of contribution margin, we actually saw an improvement, save for the spike that I told you about in MPESA commissions, which went up for the first time in probably 3 or 4 years. And what we can speak about that has actually affected the numbers this time is a provision for receivables. And this is a factor, again, of the COVID situation and how it's affected not just Safaricom, but also other operators in the market. So Safaricom has interconnects, and this interconnect I'm talking about the fees that Airtel or Telkom would incur when a call is terminating on the Safaricom network. That is, if an Airtel customer calls a Safaricom customer, Airtel has to pay some sort of charge, and so does Telkom. And so this interconnect charges, coupled with co-location fees, which refer to when Safaricom shares its infrastructure with other telcos in other areas, and they have to pay Safaricom for that access. Safaricom has been prudent to set aside a provision which came through the income statement, and that is what affected the costs if you look at the numbers. Okay. But if you look at the traditional costs, and the most important ones are in terms of network costs, airtime commissions. Of course, I talked about the MPESA commissions that had a gain for the first time this year. Network expenses and airtime commissions actually performed quite in line. These are very crucial for Safaricom because, I mean, a lot of the OPEX intensity comes from those two lines. So I'm quite satisfied with the progress we are seeing Safaricom making in terms of OPEX management. We expect this to continue because Safaricom has quite a lot of opportunities to capitalize on for the next 5 to 7 years. Okay. And so managing that OPEX will continue to be a priority for them. And so I expect, while the OPEX number in itself might not decrease in value, the ratio of the operating expenses to revenue is definitely going to continue declining over time. Okay. So that's quite positive for Safaricom.
Ah, fantastic. Some positive news at the very least. Tracy, we'll just take a short break. When we come back, we can wind up the conversation and look at the outlook as well as the potential of a dividend payout, because we did notice there was a negative cash position from this company. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just an overview of the financials for Safaricom. Our SMS line is 20146. We want you to chime in and tell us what were your thoughts. Is this conversation making sense? How can we be able to help you understand the fundamentals so that you can be able to make an investment decision when it comes to Safaricom? We shall see you after the break as we continue on this discourse. See you shortly.